Hey everyone! Before we dive in, I've got a quick question for you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments because I'd love to know. And while you're at it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss videos like this. Now, let's get real. Have you ever noticed how some of the strongest, most loyal men quietly carry the weight of the world, yet the people closest to them barely notice? Today, we're uncovering the hidden patterns in female psychology that can unknowingly break a good man, and why the regret usually only comes after it's too late. Stick around, because this is eye-opening, and it might make you see relationships in a whole new way. Way 1. Emotional blindness. Taking his stability for granted. Good men are often admired for their unwavering strength. They are the men who stay steady when everything around them is falling apart. They are the ones who show up consistently, who listen without judgment, who fix problems quietly without making a fuss. Their strength is not just physical or material, it is deeply emotional. A good man carries stability in every aspect of his life. He carries it for himself, for those he loves, and often for everyone around him. People naturally gravitate toward him because they know they can rely on him, because they know he will not falter under pressure. His presence is a constant source of reassurance, a quiet force that holds relationships, families, and friendships together. But this very strength, which seems unshakable, can also become a trap. Many women, consciously or unconsciously, develop what I call emotional blindness toward such men. They begin to assume that because he is strong, he doesn't feel pain. They assume that because he is reliable, he doesn't need recognition. They assume that because he remains patient and understanding, he will always endure, no matter what. This is the subtle yet devastating mistake that slowly begins to erode the very foundation of a good man's emotional health. Emotional blindness manifests in many ways. She may stop noticing the countless little gestures he makes, from staying up late to help her solve a problem, to quietly supporting her ambitions, to simply being present when she needs comfort. These are actions that require emotional energy, that require patience, and yet they often go unrecognized because she assumes they are natural, or worse, guaranteed. Over time, she begins to see these acts of love as obligations he fulfills automatically, forgetting that they come at the cost of his own emotional bandwidth. Another manifestation of emotional blindness is the lack of gratitude. A good man who continuously invests his time, energy, and love into a relationship deserves acknowledgement. Yet, when a woman stops appreciating these efforts, the man begins to feel invisible. He feels as though his contributions, which once mattered, no longer carry any weight. This is particularly damaging because good men are not asking for praise or attention in a loud or demanding way. Their acts of love are quiet, often unnoticed, but profoundly important. The absence of acknowledgement slowly chips away at his sense of worth within the relationship. Over time, this emotional neglect accumulates. A good man is not immune to feelings of being undervalued. He may not show it outwardly, but internally, he begins to question whether his efforts are truly seen, whether his love is truly appreciated, and whether his presence is genuinely needed. Emotional blindness by the very person he trusts most creates a paradox. He remains loyal and committed, yet his emotional needs go unmet. This paradox is exhausting because he is giving more than he receives, yet he is often blamed or criticized for not doing enough. The quiet toll of emotional blindness is further amplified when combined with a lack of empathy. Women who are emotionally blind often fail to consider how their words, actions, or indifference affect him. They may dismiss his subtle cues of fatigue, stress, or disappointment. They may unintentionally prioritize their own comfort or satisfaction over his emotional well-being. This lack of reciprocal emotional investment creates a dangerous imbalance in the relationship, one where the good man bears the brunt of emotional labor without recognition or support. Emotional blindness also fosters emotional distance. A good man, initially patient and understanding, gradually starts to withdraw. He may no longer share his thoughts and feelings as openly, no longer initiate conversations about deeper emotional topics, and no longer offer the same level of emotional support he once did. This withdrawal is not born from anger or resentment alone. It is a protective mechanism. He has learned that his emotional investment is often invisible, that his stability is taken for granted, and that his vulnerability is met with indifference rather than appreciation. The irony is that many women only recognize the consequences of this emotional blindness when it is too late. They notice his absence, his silence, or his emotional detachment, and they are shocked to realize how much he has given and how little was acknowledged. The regret comes not because he left immediately, but because she finally sees what was once constant and reliable, and how much value it held. The good man's strength, which once seemed inexhaustible, is now a quiet shadow of its former self, and the emotional gap created by neglect becomes painfully clear. Emotional blindness is particularly dangerous because it often occurs unintentionally. It is rarely about malice or deliberate neglect. Many women who take a good man's stability for granted genuinely care for him, love him even, and yet fail to recognize the cumulative effect of small, overlooked moments. These small moments, repeated over months and years, create a fracture that slowly grows. And the man, who once silently carried the weight of emotional labor with grace, begins to retreat inward, leaving a quiet emptiness in the relationship that cannot be easily repaired. Way 2. Weaponizing his love, pushing boundaries because he's too good to leave. One of the most subtle but destructive patterns in female psychology emerges when a woman unconsciously begins to weaponize the love of a good man. This is not about intentional cruelty or malice. It is rarely a conscious act. Instead, it stems from a deep-seated belief that he is strong enough, loyal enough, and forgiving enough to withstand behaviors that would destabilize other men. In other words, she begins to assume that he is too good to leave, and in this assumption, she pushes boundaries that slowly, imperceptibly erode his emotional well-being. Weaponizing his love often starts innocuously. At first, she tests his patience in small ways. She might tease him in ways that cross emotional lines, or make decisions that inconvenience him without considering his perspective. She might be late for commitments she knows he values, cancel plans without warning, or dismiss his concerns as trivial. Each action, on its own, may seem minor, but combined with the underlying assumption that he will always forgive, it begins to accumulate into a subtle pattern of emotional strain. As time goes on, these tests become bolder. She may begin to criticize him for things that are beyond his control, question his decisions unnecessarily, or highlight perceived shortcomings in front of others. She might even manipulate situations to gain an emotional advantage, exploiting his loyalty and patience to meet her own needs. This behavior is often masked by affection, laughter, or seemingly harmless banter, which makes it difficult for him to confront or resist. The man who genuinely loves her sees these moments as exceptions, as temporary frustrations that will pass, rather than the start of a repeated pattern. A good man, by his nature, absorbs a great deal of emotional weight. He is often the problem solver in the relationship, the one who sacrifices comfort for stability, the one who carries both his own and his partner's burdens without complaint. But when his love is weaponized, the very traits that make him admirable become the channels through which he experiences emotional strain. His patience is tested not because he is weak, but because he is strong enough to endure, and the woman comes to rely on this endurance as though it is infinite. The danger in this dynamic is the illusion of permanence it creates. She begins to believe that his loyalty is unconditional and inexhaustible. She feels safe in taking liberties, assuming that he will remain devoted regardless of her actions. Yet, what she fails to recognize is that good men are not immune to emotional depletion. Love is not a resource that can be endlessly exploited without consequence. When a man consistently gives more than he receives, when he constantly absorbs emotional imbalance, he begins to retreat, not out of anger, but as a necessary act of self-preservation. Weaponizing a good man's love also erodes intimacy. Emotional closeness requires mutual respect and reciprocity. When one partner consistently tests, challenges, or manipulates the other under the guise of trust or love, it disrupts the balance of vulnerability that intimacy depends on. The man may continue to show affection and commitment, but the emotional connection slowly deteriorates. He becomes guarded, selective about what he shares, and increasingly cautious about investing in moments of emotional exposure. The love that once flowed freely is now filtered through layers of protective restraint. Regret often comes late because the woman does not notice the change until it is irreversible. She may initially see his patience as endless and misinterpret his quiet withdrawal as temporary moodiness or stress. She fails to perceive the gradual tightening of boundaries, the subtle reduction in emotional engagement, and the growing distance that comes from repeated exploitation of his love. And when she finally does notice, the man has already begun to build walls, not out of resentment, but out of necessity. His emotional energy, once abundant, is no longer available for the same level of giving. The realization that she has weaponized his love usually hits hardest when contrasted with the attention and care he once freely offered. She remembers the nights he stayed awake to comfort her, the times he put her needs before his own, the countless sacrifices made without complaint. She recalls his unwavering support and the strength he provided during moments of chaos. And in the present, she sees him as distant, reserved, and emotionally protective. The stark contrast between what was once abundant and what is now measured creates a painful awareness of loss. A loss she may have never fully appreciated until it becomes evident. The pattern of weaponizing a good man's love is often reinforced by a sense of security. Because he has proven himself resilient, reliable, and forgiving, she unconsciously assumes that her actions will not have long-term consequences. This miscalculation is dangerous because emotional endurance has limits. Even the strongest men reach points where the cumulative weight of disregard, testing, and manipulation overwhelms them. When this threshold is crossed, the emotional withdrawal is not a reactionary punishment. It is the natural outcome of sustained imbalance in the relationship. A good man's departure or detachment is rarely sudden. It happens in stages, each subtle and difficult to notice until the final distance is evident. First, he may reduce the frequency of deep emotional conversations. Then, he may begin prioritizing his own well-being over her tests and manipulations. His patience may no longer extend to unnecessary drama, and his previously unwavering presence may become conditional. These changes are quiet but powerful, and by the time she fully registers them, the foundation of the relationship has already shifted in ways that are difficult to reverse. Way 3. Emotional criticism. Slowly destroying his self-worth. Emotional criticism is one of the most subtle yet devastating ways women can harm good men without even realizing it. Unlike overt aggression, which is visible and can be confronted, emotional criticism is often quiet, consistent, and internalized. It does not always come in the form of yelling or harsh words. It manifests in repeated remarks, judgments, comparisons, or expressions of disappointment that chip away at a man's sense of self. Good men are naturally patient and resilient, and they often endure these criticisms without retaliation. They absorb the negativity quietly, trying to remain understanding and supportive, hoping that love and patience can repair the small fractures before they widen into irreparable cracks. A good man's strength is often mistaken for invulnerability. Many women assume that because he appears confident, calm, and capable, he is immune to emotional harm. This assumption makes it easier to offer criticism casually, dismissing the long-term impact it has on him. It may start with comments about minor imperfections, like his appearance, choices, or habits. At first, he may brush them off, recognizing them as minor or unintentional. However, as these remarks accumulate, they begin to leave a subtle but profound imprint on his psyche. Each comment, each suggestion that he is lacking in some way, slowly erodes the confidence and self-esteem that once defined him. The danger of emotional criticism lies in its persistence and repetition. Unlike a single act of anger or an isolated insult, emotional criticism is ongoing. It creates a pattern where a good man begins to question whether his efforts, his character, and his love are ever enough. The criticism may not always be direct. It can come through sarcasm, subtle condescension, or comparisons to others. Comments like, "Why can't you be more like him?" or "You should be doing more," may seem innocent or constructive on the surface, but they send a message that his inherent qualities and consistent efforts are insufficient. Over time, this message is internalized, creating a self-doubt that quietly gnaws at his confidence. Good men are often emotionally intelligent, And part of that intelligence involves trying to accommodate and understand their partner's perspective. They take criticism seriously because they care and because they want to improve. Unfortunately, this willingness to self-reflect can make them more vulnerable to consistent negative feedback. They internalize the criticism, scrutinize their actions, and try to adapt, often at the expense of their own emotional stability. Instead of recognizing that the critique may be unfair or disproportionate, they begin to believe that they are indeed falling short in ways that matter. The cumulative effect of emotional criticism is an erosion of self-worth. A good man who once stood confidently in his capabilities begins to doubt his judgment, question his decisions, and minimize his achievements. The quiet strength that once defined him becomes overshadowed by insecurity. He may continue to perform his duties, to show love, and to remain loyal, but internally, a struggle grows. Each day, the emotional weight of repeated criticism adds to the burden he carries, creating a sense of inadequacy that is difficult to shake. This pattern is particularly insidious because it often goes unnoticed by the woman herself. Many women offering criticism do so from a place of concern, frustration, or desire to improve the relationship. They may not realize that the frequency, tone, or nature of their comments is slowly undermining the very man they claim to love. Emotional criticism is rarely a single act of malice. It is a series of small, cumulative actions that, over time, destabilize a good man's confidence and emotional health. As the emotional erosion continues, a good man may start to change subtly in response. He may withdraw from conversations that feel judgmental, become less expressive, or start avoiding situations where he anticipates criticism. He may begin to second-guess himself constantly, making decisions tentatively and seeking approval more than ever before. The warmth and openness he once offered freely may diminish, replaced by caution and guardedness. This withdrawal is not born of anger or resentment alone. It is a protective mechanism, an instinctive response to preserve what remains of his self-worth. Emotional criticism also impacts intimacy in profound ways. Emotional connection depends on vulnerability, trust, and the ability to share freely without fear of judgment. When a good man is consistently criticized, he learns to protect himself by limiting vulnerability. He may no longer share his deepest thoughts, feelings, or ambitions for fear of being dismissed or belittled. This self-protection, while necessary, creates a growing distance in the relationship. The love he gives becomes measured, careful, and restrained. And the emotional closeness that once defined the partnership begins to wane. The regret that follows emotional criticism often arrives too late. Women may not notice the changes until the man has already begun to detach emotionally, reduce his engagement, or leave entirely. They may see him as distant or cold and feel puzzled, unaware that the slow accumulation of criticism eroded the connection they once shared. At that point, the man's withdrawal is complete, and the emotional bond that took years to build cannot easily be restored. The realization of loss is painful, not just because of his absence, but because they understand too late the cost of their words and the subtle ways they damage someone they claimed to love. Emotional criticism is therefore a quiet but powerful force. It has the ability to erode confidence, diminish emotional resilience, and create lasting self-doubt in a good man. It does not require intentional cruelty or malice to be effective. Its power lies in repetition, subtlety, and persistence. Over time, even the strongest, most patient men can be deeply affected, reshaping the emotional landscape of the relationship in ways that are difficult to repair. Way 4. Emotional neglect. Expecting him to carry the relationship alone. Emotional neglect is one of the most insidious ways good men are broken, because it is often invisible until the damage has already been done. Unlike overt conflict, emotional neglect does not produce immediate tension or dramatic fights, which makes it easier to overlook. Instead, it slowly creates a sense of imbalance, where the good man becomes the sole emotional anchor in the relationship. He is expected to solve problems, provide comfort, maintain stability, and consistently offer love, while his own emotional needs are neglected or dismissed. Over time, this imbalance weighs heavily on him, and the emotional cost becomes unbearable. A good man naturally invests in the well-being of those he loves. He provides support, protection, and reassurance, often without complaint. He notices her mood changes, anticipates her needs, and sacrifices his own comfort to maintain harmony. He becomes the person who carries not only his own emotional load, but also that of his partner. Initially, this can feel rewarding because his efforts are often met with appreciation and reciprocation. However, when emotional neglect begins, his efforts are no longer matched. Instead of feeling valued, he feels overlooked. Instead of being supported, he becomes the only one supporting. The imbalance grows quietly, unnoticed by the woman, but painfully clear to him. Emotional neglect often begins subtly. She may stop asking about his day, fail to notice his feelings, or dismiss his concerns. She may expect him to plan activities, initiate conversations, and resolve conflicts while she remains passive or indifferent. In the early stages, he may rationalize this neglect as temporary or assume that she is busy or stressed. He may reassure himself that he is capable of handling the extra emotional responsibility and that this phase will pass. Yet, over time, the neglect becomes a pattern, creating an unspoken expectation that he will always carry the relationship alone. The impact of this neglect is profound. A good man thrives on mutual effort and emotional reciprocity. When he constantly gives without receiving comparable care, he begins to feel drained. His emotional energy is finite, and despite his patience and loyalty, prolonged neglect erodes his resilience. He may begin to feel isolated, as though he is the only one invested in the emotional health of the relationship. The silent accumulation of these small imbalances chips away at his enthusiasm, his warmth, and his desire to engage fully. Over time, he becomes quieter, more reserved, and more cautious with his love. Another aspect of emotional neglect is the erosion of intimacy. Emotional connection requires both partners to contribute, share vulnerabilities, and offer support. When one partner consistently withholds attention, fails to acknowledge feelings, or ignores the emotional labor of the other, intimacy begins to fade. A good man may initially continue to offer love and care in hopes of maintaining connection, but as neglect persists, he gradually withdraws. The very qualities that make him dependable and loving are muted, not because he no longer cares, but because the relationship no longer provides the mutual support necessary to sustain those qualities. Emotional neglect also fosters frustration and resentment, although these emotions are often internalized by a good man rather than expressed outwardly. He may struggle with feelings of unappreciation, disappointment, and isolation, yet refrain from complaining or demanding attention. His patience and loyalty, which were once sources of pride, begin to feel like burdens. He may start questioning the fairness of the relationship, wondering why he is expected to shoulder so much emotional responsibility without reciprocity. Despite his internal struggle, he often continues giving, fearing that expressing dissatisfaction might disrupt the relationship or hurt the person he loves. The danger of emotional neglect is heightened by its invisibility. Many women who inadvertently neglect their partner do so not out of malice, but because they assume he is strong enough to handle it, or they fail to recognize his emotional needs. They may interpret his patience and reliability as evidence that he requires less attention and care. This misunderstanding creates a vicious cycle. The more neglected he feels, the quieter he becomes. The quieter he becomes, the less attention she gives. And the less attention she gives, the more emotional distance develops. Regret often comes too late. Women may not realize the impact of emotional neglect until the good man begins to detach, reduce his efforts, or withdraw from the relationship entirely. They notice a change in his demeanor, a decrease in his engagement, or a lack of emotional intimacy that once defined their connection. By the time they recognize the damage, the man's emotional boundaries are firmly in place. He has learned to protect himself by conserving energy, limiting vulnerability, and focusing on his own emotional well-being. The relationship may still exist in form, but the emotional depth that once made it strong is irreversibly altered. A key aspect of emotional neglect is that it is cumulative. Small moments of inattentiveness, lack of acknowledgement, and minimal emotional support add up over time. They do not create immediate confrontation, but they slowly erode the trust and connection that a good man has invested in the relationship. The neglect teaches him to adjust his expectations, reduce his emotional investment, and ultimately distance himself as a means of self-preservation. His withdrawal is not an act of rebellion. It is a natural response to repeated imbalance and emotional disregard. Ultimately, emotional neglect is a quiet but powerful force. It transforms the dynamic of a relationship without overt conflict, leaving the good man carrying the emotional weight alone. His patience, loyalty, and love, once abundant, become measured and restrained. The imbalance reshapes the connection, diminishes intimacy, and slowly changes the man he was. Even if the relationship continues, it is forever altered by the silent accumulation of unmet emotional needs.